in 45 minutes on BBC Two after Politics Live.
It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
There are two groups of people who make judgments on an incoming government. One is the international markets, the money markets, of course, but actually the most important people are the electorate.
Downing Street says the Prime Minister has full confidence in his Chancellor and she'll be in post for the whole of this Parliament. But is Rachel Reeves's economic strategy working?
Growth is the challenge and investment is the solution. Investment in new industries, new technologies and new infrastructure.
That was last autumn. But are the Chancellor's plans to borrow tens of billions of pounds for investment to tackle climate change still affordable?
Not all cultures are equal. We should be very careful about who is coming into this country and the scale of immigration.
Senior Conservatives are calling for the party to take a tougher stance on immigration. Are they right?
In this parish, we have a lot of holiday lets also, and this is having a knock-on effect of young people being able to afford a house to live in the area.
And second homeowners will face higher taxes later this year. Joining me, Labour MP Perrin Moon, Conservative MP and Shadow Culture Minister Saqib Bhatti, Alva Ray from Bloomberg and Mercy Muroki, political commentator and former advisor to Kemi Badenoch. This is Politics Live. Well, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, makes a number of the front pages in terms of her future. Let's have a look at a few of them. The Daily Telegraph. Prime Minister throws Reeves's future into doubt. This is in response to answers he gave yesterday at a press conference. The Daily Star says, should we be popping out for another lettuce? This is a reference to whether a lettuce, a previous one, or Liz Truss as Prime Minister would last the longest before the lettuce wilted. And finally, on the front page of The Guardian, Starmer backs Reeves and warns of ruthless public spending cuts. Now, all of those headlines refer, as I say, to this press conference as to whether Rachel Reeves would and should remain Chancellor for the whole of this Parliament. Keir Starmer declined to answer the question directly, but did say that she had his full confidence and was doing a fantastic job. So I'm going to put the question to the panel, starting with you, Perrin. Will Rachel Reeves still be Chancellor by the end of this Parliament?
Yes, I think so. I think she will. We've got a long-term strategy to get growth back into the economy. We've trying to fix so many challenges across government after 14 years of chaos from the Conservatives. We're fully behind Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's plan to do that.
Right. And should she stay in place? Do you think her economic strategy is working?
Yes, I think it is absolutely the right strategy. This is a long-term plan, and it's something that we have talked about before the election, and people voted for change, and that is what we're going to deliver. Will
the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, still be in post at the end of the Parliament, Saqib?
I think it's hard to see how that's possible, Jo. Look, ultimately, that's a decision for Keir Starmer. He's backed her very belatedly, by the way, yesterday. You know, and ultimately, though, this is a crisis that has been born out of Downing Street. Number 10 and number 11 have done this together. I think she's fighting for her political survival today.
Right. I mean, obviously,
I think Saqib's probably judging Labour politicians on the same way that he did Conservative politicians. We're absolutely not in the game of short-term changes, chasing headlines. We're in this for the long term. We know that the Conservatives changed, chopped and changed. Chancellors every 5 minutes. It's not going to be the case with Labour. We're in it for the long term.
Well, Perrin, it's not actually my judgment. It's the judgment of the debt markets, and their verdict has been damning. We've got, debt, interest rates on debt, long-term debt, highest in 30 years. I mean, they have delivered their verdict, and we should be very, very clear. She's off. The reason she's in this position is because she and Keir Starmer have boxed themselves in. She's probably going to end up breaking her fiscal rules. She's borrowing something like £32 billion a year, right. £70 billion worth of spending. It's just unsustainable. The debt markets are saying it.
You're shaking your head.
No, I mean, the debt markets, if you look at what's happening in the States, we're in a particular position with a new president coming in. There is some market movement, but actually, if you look what's happening globally, it's very, very similar. We've got a specific plan to get growth back into the economy. We've seen levels of private investment being announced over the last few months, and that will
Right. I mean, interestingly, former Conservative Chancellor Ken Clarke was asked about what was causing this spike in borrowing costs, and he said it was the world financial situation that was the main problem. He goes on to say, I think if Keir Starmer was to sack Rachel Reeves at the present time, it would demonstrate that Keir Starmer has less skill and political nous than I have. Was you wrong?
Well, look, first of all, there is, of course, if you look at the debt markets, I'm only stating fact that the global debt market, there is a sell-off in global bonds, but the differential in rates between what Germany's selling it for and what the UK is selling for is very, very different. We are in a very, very difficult situation, and the verdict from the debt markets is damning.
Alva, will Rachel Reeves still be Chancellor at the end of the Parliament?
I think it's a good question, and it's a harder question to answer than is she in trouble, which is yes. I mean, she really, really is. Everything that Saqib was just saying is completely right, and it's obviously true to say that there are global factors influencing this, but some of this is quite specific to the UK, and Rachel Reeves has had a personal hand in some of it, in that she just didn't leave herself very much headroom in the budget, so she didn't leave herself much extra cash. So rather than these fluctuations happening and having enough space to handle it, basically, any time these markets move, she sort of is breaking her own rules and at risk of having to cut spending, which would be really difficult. And so, obviously, she's hoping that if she just waits, things will calm down again. Because this happened right after the budget, and then that spike reversed. But she's in a really, really tricky position. That was within her control, how much headroom she gave herself, and also just like the impact that she's had on business confidence and consumer confidence since she became Chancellor has been quite tricky. It's really, really bad for her credibility. But I think that question that you asked about what will actually happen to her is much more complicated because Keir Starmer is so sort of binded to her politically. I've been talking to loads of MPs about this, and I think just for a lot of them, they think it would leave Keir Starmer himself quite exposed if he lost his Chancellor. So I'm really not sure which way it will go, but I think, you know, as Ken Clarke says, I think it would maybe look like even more of a panic if he lost Rachel Reeves, but I don't know if that will hold until the end of the Parliament.
Well, interestingly, Mercy, just before I come to you, BBC News is saying that the pound and UK borrowing costs have shown signs of stabilising after a turbulent few days. So do you think she'll still be Chancellor in 5 years?
I mean, I think it would signal massive instability if she wasn't to remain the Chancellor for at least the next couple of years. And the last thing anybody wants is further instability. We've, for various reasons, have had massive levels of economic and political instability. People voted for a Labour government, and Labour was promising change. And, you know, if we're talking about change from what we've experienced over the last few years, then of course everybody needs stability, whether that's people, households for their own finances, whether it's the money markets, you know, businesses as well. Businesses here at home desperately need stability. So for me, it would be very odd for Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves to have stood on this manifesto promising the economic platform they did, only to kind of backtrack and for him to sort of sack her a year into it.
Are the Conservatives actually calling for Rachel Reeves to resign?
Look, my view on this is very clear. I think this is a decision for Keir Starmer to make. But for me,
well,
you know,
that's true. But are you calling? I mean, you've set out a pretty damning sort of indictment of Rachel Reeves. Are you saying she should go?
So no, my view on this actually is, and it's kind of what Mercy said, which is I worry about the people who are, you know, remortgaging, the interest rates, all those kind of things.
Yeah, but this
actually,
is not the same as Liz Truss in terms of what's happening to.
I think she's in a worse position actually, because she's really boxed herself.
Position than Liz Truss.
There are no good options for Rachel Reeves, right? Rachel Reeves now has to decide whether she embarks on a period of austerity, and the Labour MPs have to be honest about that, or she raises taxes.
So should she go?
Options. Well, look, I think Keir Starmer's going to have to decide that. I'm not going to make those judgments for him.
Final word to you, Perrin.
I mean, it's utterly extraordinary to equate Liz Truss's position with that of.
Well, the debt rates are higher.
It's a complete nonsense. You know, we've been elected on a mandate for change. We have a clear strategy. It is going to take some time, Joe. It is going to take time for us to turn around.
It's whether she has the time, of course.
And well, you know, we 100% support both Keir and Rachel.
All right. Well, let's move on. although I should say that Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, will be up in the Commons this afternoon giving a statement after her recent trip to China, which the Conservatives said she shouldn't have embarked upon when all this turbulence, as they see it, is going on. Let's talk to Paul Johnson, the Director of the leading economic research group, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul, before we get on to plans for extra borrowing, on the back of this discussion, which you've probably heard part of, do you think the markets have lost confidence broadly in Rachel Reeves's economic strategy?
No, I don't really think that's what this has been about. This has clearly been driven by what's been happening in the US and the scale of the debt and problems that Rachel Reeves inherited. It is the case that our debt interest rates are much higher than they are in France and Germany, but that's down as much to the external deficit that we have, the fact that we have a very big trade deficit, the fact that we are reliant on international investors really to buy our debt. I do think that there have been some problems with Rachel Reeves's strategy. She did increase taxes a lot and spending by even more back in the budget. So we've got even more debt to sell this year. And the fact that those tax increases largely fell on business won't have helped, but is the bigger part of the reason that we're seeing these increases in debt interest down to what she's done? No, I think that's largely down to the broader state of our public finances and our relationship to the costs of borrowing in the US. Do I think a bit of it is down to some of what she's done? Then yes, but I think it's the smaller bit.
All right. Well, in the October budget, which we are talking about to some extent, Rachel Reeves also announced plans for extra borrowing over this Parliament, an additional £100 billion over the next 5 years for investment spending and to make Britain a clean energy superpower. With the cost of borrowing rising, hitting a 30-year high, is that still affordable, Paul?
Well, it's clearly more expensive than it otherwise would have been, but that's not the bigger part of the problem that we're facing. We are spending well over £100 billion a year on debt interest at the moment. So that is a huge cost, and that is something that's creating problems for the whole of the rest of the public sector. Now, the increases in, against the level of capital spending that we were spending last year, we're not actually increasing spending at all. The increases were against the plans for cuts that were there in Jeremy Hunt's last budget. So I think that's important to get clear about the baseline. Whilst the plans went up, they only went up to maintain spending on infrastructure and investment at the same level as they were last year. They do involve more borrowing, that is for sure, and that is one of the contributors to the increased cost of borrowing, and that is there are clearly limits to that. But I do think actually one of the few positives actually of the budget back in October was, for the first time ever really, a chancellor coming into office facing a big fiscal problem did not cut investment spending on the basis that in the long run, investment spending should be good for economic growth. Right,
but is the amount that she is planning to borrow sustainable against the backdrop that you have just explained?
Well, the amount that she's this is part of the problem. It's essentially not sustainable against her own fiscal rule, which we've briefly mentioned. I mean, her rule is that she wants to borrow only to invest. And actually, because of these increases in interest rates, it may well be that the Office of Budget Responsibility says that she's not achieving that. So on that basis, it may turn out not to be sustainable. It is also just more expensive. It's more difficult whenever interest rates go up to borrow more, because that makes the whole process more pricey. And she might want to come back to whether there is some trimming she wants to do on that. But again, to be clear, our public sector net investment is still relatively low compared with many other countries. All that she's doing really is maintaining it where it was over the last couple of years, and part of the issue is actually that a lot of the more of the additional spending that we saw in the budget was not actually on investment. It was on day-to-day spending. It was on increasing public sector pay, for example, and trying to sort out the NHS and the court system and all those things.
Paul Johnson, thank you very much. Perrin, let's start with you. Listening to all of that, if we take some of those points in turn, we now know that servicing the debt is much, much more expensive. We know that she has a fiscal rule that she's only going to borrow to invest, and that borrowing has become more expensive. Is it now time to change those plans, those borrowing to invest in green, particularly green climate change policies?
Look, our fiscal rules are set in stone. We are not going to change our fiscal rules. They are ironclad. We've got a plan which is around investment into infrastructure. These are investments into Britain. So this is, as Paul Johnson just said there, these are long-term investments that are going to benefit the economy, and we're not going to be blown off course from that perspective. Well, in relation to the OBR, we have to wait
because the Office for Budget Responsibility will make a judgment. Yes. They'll give a verdict on her plans, her budget, in line with her fiscal rules, borrowing to invest, balancing the day-to-day spending budget. And if they come back and say the maths don't add up, you're not going to change any of the...
Well, that's conjecture. Let's see what the OBR says.
Right. Saqib?
Look, I was listening to Paul, and actually the reality is where the markets have taken Rachel Reeves now on her 5-year scorecard. She, as very well reported, that her buffer is massively reduced. I think it's been reported.
Absolutely, but can she go ahead with borrowing the amounts of money that she wants to in order to invest in terms of tackling...
This completely kiboshes her plans, because how are you going to borrow? How are you going to borrow? How are you going to service the debt? Even if we agree that some of those investments were well-intentioned, the pure maths of this are going to make it incredibly difficult for her. I just don't see, personally, how it's sustainable or how her fiscal rules are now going to be ironclad or stoneclad.
Look, we've got to remember that this level of investment attracts private investment. Now, I've just mentioned £63 billion worth of investment, private sector investment announced pre-Christmas, another £14 billion that was announced yesterday. If we invest in infrastructure, if we invest in UK PLC, we're able to crowd in private sector investment, and that is a core part of the strategy. It's the relationship between the state and the private sector to rebuild our economy.
Right. Saqib?
Go talk to some businesses, right?
And
the business community, the business community through and through is saying that they've had to kibosh their plans. Keir Starmer talked down the economy. Rachel Reeves then followed it through with the budget. Consumer confidence, business confidence is negative.
Right, but the problem for the government potentially is this is a core part of their growth strategy. So should she press ahead? Is it still affordable for the Chancellor to press ahead with her investment plans in climate change policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a mistake. Great British Energy sort of setting up a publicly owned energy company was a bit of a... I think it's misdirected. I think the government could have sort of used those resources to continue leveraging private investment rather than kind of setting up a whole new entity that will be sort of publicly owned energy. I think it is right that the government invests to bolster our energy security. Yeah. I think everybody agrees we need to be less dependent on particularly hostile nations that we rely on. We're not going to see those returns. We're not going to see the returns in the investments for a very, very long time. So,
So don't do them at all?
I think it's right to do them. I just don't think Labour have necessarily gone about it in the right way, in a way that is going to maximise private investment. And on actually the energy point, we heard Keir Starmer yesterday talking about investing in AI and making the UK an AI sort of hub. AI requires huge amounts of energy, huge amounts of electricity. We have some of the highest electricity costs, definitely across Europe, potentially across the world. There's no real long-term thinking about how the investment into AI, how they're going to manage that with the high electricity costs and how they're going to bring that down.
Well, the promises are that things like GB Energy are supposed to bring bills down eventually, although we don't know quite when or by how much.
Yeah, and I mean, to Mercy's point, I mean, the thinking behind something like GB Energy is that, you've got £1 of public investment for about £3 of private investment, that you are trying to attract that private investment. I actually would be quite surprised if the government substantially reduced its investment in green spending, because, as you say, Rachel Reeves is just desperate for growth. That's the thing that will save this whole situation for her and probably for Keir Starmer. As we were talking about whether she would still be Chancellor in 5 years, I was actually thinking probably the question is whether Keir Starmer will also be Prime Minister in 5 years. They're so interlinked that, there would still be a Labour government. But I think if she falls, he falls. And I think, so the things that they're doing for growth are the things they'll prioritise. I actually think the bigger question is around cuts to welfare and disability benefits, which are already penciled in, but they might have to be even deeper after these market movements. I think that's sort of where
well, and we
definitely
talked a lot about
difficult.
austerity. I mean, the other side, if you like, of the ledger for some people. But on GB Energy, is it still affordable to have GB Energy, a state-owned energy company, which in the long term, and it could be the very long term, might bring bills down?
Joe, I was on the GB Energy Bill Committee. It is absolutely the right thing to do. Let me just, talk about crowding in private investment. If I can come back to where I'm from in Cornwall, we've got massive opportunities with floating offshore wind, with geothermal energy, with tidal energy. We've got huge resources of critical minerals such as lithium and tin. It's the right thing to do in terms of investment. Investment is already going into places like Cornwall. It's the right thing to do for jobs in areas such as mine, which have very high levels of deprivation. It's the right thing to do for climate change as well.
Right.
To help us.
But if you look, I think you were referencing, Mercy, business leaders. The Daily Telegraph, British industry faces extinction because of net zero. This is Jim Ratcliffe, who heads up INEOS. INEOS's boss warning comes after closure of Scottish manufacturing site with loss of 80 jobs. And that is because of soaring energy costs and this shift to net zero policies.
But look at those soaring energy costs. If you look where our energy reliance at the moment, this is about energy security. Our move away from a reliance on fossil fuels from bad actors, and the focus on making sure that we've got much more control, much more security of our energy is precisely why this is the right policy for Britain.
Mercy?
I mean, I don't think there's many people, and actually the Conservative Party had a great track record in terms of leveraging private investment in energy and had a great environmental record as well. So I think even the Conservative Party, for the most part, is agreed that there needs to be long-term investment into energy. Maybe, it sits perhaps not as well with some people these days because of the amount of money that is needed to be injected into public services, into the day-to-day things that sort of people see very viscerally, like education, like health. And I think it's perhaps a bit disingenuous at the moment of the government to not be very honest with the public that there needs to be cuts, massive cuts, actually. And I think those cuts will eventually have to come, with things like to DWP. And there's 2.6 million people in long-term sickness off work. Yeah. There needs to be some sort of plan from the government about how they plan to.
Do you accept that? There'll have to be massive cuts in welfare?
No, because these investments into things like education, into things like the work well programmes that we have, into the NHS, they're investments in the economy as well. Employers are paying huge amounts in sick pay at the moment for people waiting to get looked after in the NHS. We've got massive challenges around the NHS. We've got massive challenges around the public sector generally, dealing with the strikes, getting people back to work is an investment in the economy.
£15 billion that the welfare budget is expected to increase by 2029. So how are you going to mitigate that as a government to get people back into work?
We have to improve productivity, and you cannot improve productivity while people cannot get to work or they're sitting at home because they're unwell, because the NHS isn't fit for purpose.
The reality is that the cuts are coming to the welfare bill anyway, even before all these market movements, because Labour basically inherited cuts from the Tories and said in the budget that they would match them. They just haven't said how they're going to do that yet, and they've kind of kicked the can down the road a few times. But in the spring, we are going to see the beginning of cuts to disability benefit, which I think will just be really, really tricky for people like Perrin to come on to shows like this and defend. Really, really tricky and completely unavoidable. And it could be even worse after these market movements because they'll need to make more cuts.
And what do you say in response to the IFS, who we've just had on, who say that £12 billion of savings, which is what the previous Conservative government had outlined in welfare savings, were, I think they said, difficult to the extreme?
Well, look, I think Rishi Sunak was very clear in the election that this was going to have to happen. The welfare budget was ballooning. We knew that, and there were going to have to be tough decisions on that. What has changed over the last week and a half is with that buffer going down, those cuts are going to have to be deeper. And, we saw the briefings over the weekend. The rolling of the pitch has already started. The disability cuts are coming, and they might be worse.
Right. I mean, just briefly, before we do move on, John McDonnell, former Labour chancellor under Jeremy Corbyn, called for more taxes, a wealth tax. Higher income taxes. I mean, that is the other alternative, of course, in terms of raising money.
Yes, except Rachel Reeves has boxed herself in completely. She said, I read my lips, no new tax rises, which she really didn't need to say. Absolutely extraordinary. And so now the other side of that coin is breaking her own promises, which would be really difficult for her credibility as well.
The economy is probably going to be prominent tomorrow at Prime Minister's Questions when Sir Keir Starmer faces Kemi Badenoch at PMQs at noon tomorrow. To see that, join us here live on BBC Two and the iPlayer from the earlier start time of 11:15. Back to today, and a number of senior Conservatives have been giving advice to the leader Kemi Badenoch about the issue of immigration as the party works out what its policies should be. We know from the leader Kemi Badenoch, she said that she wants an annual target for net migration, but hasn't said what that number should be. Let's have a look at some of the advice that has been flowing out. The Daily Telegraph, referring to Steve Barclay, former Cabinet Minister, the time has come to pledge to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. He urges Badenoch, former Brexit Secretary, says secure borders will not be delivered while porous legislation remains. That's about the illegal boat crossings. If we have a look at this in The Guardian, it is in response to comments made by the Shadow Justice Minister Robert Jenrick. Tory MPs contact Badenoch to raise concerns about what he said about people from alien cultures. He's accused of stoking community divisions with those remarks. And then finally, this from Sir John Hayes, particularly, who actually ran the Jenrick campaign in the Daily Telegraph. Net zero immigration is the way to beat reform. Senior Tories tell party leader policy would be extremely popular and reinforce the link with our base. That's the number of people coming into the country being the same as the number that are leaving. What do you think of that policy, net zero immigration? Do you think they should take it on?
No, I just don't think it's sustainable at all. I think politicians actually need to start being very, very honest with the public about the fact we do need a level of, well, quite a high level actually of legal migration, because we have an ageing population. We simply don't have a sustainable population, and you know, we're going to need huge levels of immigration. That is simply the reality of the situation, and I think targets are a complete waste of time at this rate. We've had years and years of targets, and Kemi Badenoch herself has said it was a mistake. How the previous government sort of handled migration was a mistake.
She said it was wrong, but she wants a target.
She does want a target.
You think that's wrong?
I think the targets, you just set yourself up for failure. You set yourself up for failure. I think we can have a conversation about the quality of migration that we want and how we can manage it so that it plugs the holes that we have in our economy. But I think a pure numbers game is quite a pointless task. Personally.
Well, Saqib, what do you say to Mercy? No target. You failed to meet any target you set, it's true, on net migration, so why bother? Well,
look, first of all, what I won't do today is highlight an immigration policy. That'll be for the Shadow Immigration Minister and for Kemi to do in due time, as she said. However, I agree with Mercy, actually. Look, we need to have an honest conversation about the importance of immigration. And when we, even when we were in government, when the decision got taken for dependents not to come in with students, for example, which massively brought down the legal immigration figures, there was general acceptance. James Cleverly stood at the dispatch box and said, look, we want to attract the best talent from across the world. That should always be our number one priority. During the election and before, when you're knocking on doors, people were very, very clear. They very rarely said, look, don't import doctors from across the world, don't import highly valued software engineers. Mm-hmm. What they don't want is it's the pace of change. What they don't want is huge amounts of people coming in and overwhelming our infrastructure, our systems, and I think we should be sympathetic to that.
Right. Is it about numbers? Or isn't it?
Look, numbers play a part. There is no reality, in my view, and I think Kemi's right on this. I think numbers have to play a part because, look, the public will expect that. But we have to be, coupled with that is an honest conversation, and I think that's what's really...
We'll come on to the honest conversation, as you call it. I mean, the government wants to cut the numbers of net migration, numbers of people coming here. Do you agree, really, with Saqib in terms numbers are important?
Well, we've got to reduce the overall numbers, but I totally agree with Mercy in relation to the economy and the ageing population and the requirement for immigration that we do need into the UK. What I find most extraordinary is noises off from Conservative politicians suggesting that we leave the European Court of Human Rights. I just wanted to know whether, Saqib, do you agree with that?
Right.
Let me say this, actually. During the leadership election, Kemi was very clear about one thing. She's not ruled out anything at the moment. No. But what she said was the conversation internationally will shift, right? Because you're seeing already across Europe, Germany, looking at their migration figures. I think within the next few years, we're going to be in a very different place. Kemi did an interview yesterday where she was very clear, it's not just about the European Convention on Human Rights.
But should we leave it?
Do I think we could do our own Bill of Rights? Probably.
You rewrite the agreements in Northern Ireland.
What Kemi was very, very clear about is you also have to look at the domestic courts and what is the reality and what is the reality about how law is being implemented.
And the Conservative governments in previous years have looked at this issue. I want to go back to the comments that were made by Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, and they were explained in a tweet, which I'll come to in just a moment, but he was responding to all the discussion and debate around the grooming, rape gangs. It was in the context of calling for a national inquiry, which the Conservatives have done into those grooming gangs. They, of course, have been high-profile cases in a number of towns and cities across the UK, and in many of those cases there were British men of Pakistani heritage who were convicted. He said this in a tweet in response to that last week. The scandal started with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here. Just in response to that, are you comfortable with that language where he talks about people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women?
Well, look, as a British Pakistani male, I can tell you that is not the kind of language that I would use. And I think the reality is, I've been quite vocal on this, actually. There are a number of things I'd say on this. First of all, the number one issue on this is around the victims. We really need to remember that as politicians and as legislators. It should always be about the victims. And I think I've called for a national inquiry. I think we should know. I think we should know, is there a correlation between what's happened in Rochdale, what's happened in Rotherham, what's happened in Telford, very geographically different parts of the country, and why there were such high numbers. And I'd like to know what the truth is. Were there officials who weren't addressing the issue because they were worried about wokeism or racism or whatever the other issue is? And I think Kemi last week at the Dispatch Box was very, very good, because she recognised that there's lots of British Muslims and British Pakistanis who are law-abiding, who are patriotic.
So is he wrong? Because he sounds like he's talking about a whole culture or complete countries importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women. Was he wrong to say that?
Well, look, as I said, Joe, that's not a language I would have used, and I think we have to be very, very careful as legislators when we embark on this narrative, because ultimately we have to remember this is about the victims, and the victims deserve justice. And by the way, last week I was aghast, even Keir Starmer saying anybody who wants an inquiry is part of the far right. You do not address the far right by evading this issue. You have to hit it head on. And of course, the conversation's moved on now. Right. You've got Sarah Champion, you've got
all right.
all calling for national inquiries. Are they far right?
Right. I mean, it hasn't been called out by Kemi Badenoch herself in terms of the language that's been used here. In fact, I think we can hear a bit of Kemi Badenoch herself talking about immigration. Let's have a listen.
We need to emphasise the things that we share. Being British, British values, the things that we talked about, freedom, equal rights, personal responsibility, not discriminating people because of their sexual orientation. There are some cultures that do that. I don't think that a culture that thinks gay people should be stoned is as valid as ours. This is not a controversial thing to say. It is our job to make sure that the people who come into the country are people who love this country, who want it to succeed.
Kemi Badenoch there talking to my colleague Laura Kunsberg. This headline in The Guardian is referring to an article or an interview Kemi Badenoch gave to GB News, in which she said grooming gangs made up of peasants from sub-communities. Again, is that the language that you would use?
Well, look, I watched her interview yesterday, and what she was talking about was minorities besmirching the rest of the community, and actually what she was talking about the peasant class and things like that. I think there's a lot more nuance to this, a lot more detail. It cannot be summarised in a headline.
Alva?
I mean, what those grooming gangs did was absolutely disgusting. And I think probably people should focus on speaking about them rather than making broader generalisations about whole communities, which is clearly sort of much less helpful. But I think what's really going on here is that the Tories are really spooked by reform. And, you know, there's a new poll out today that shows Reform 2 points, I think it is, right below Labour, having overtaken the Conservatives. You have people like Robert Jenrick basically trying to pull the party to the right to get some of those voters back. But it's so difficult. You can see from Saqib's reaction that all these calls for, you know, leaving the ECHR or whatever would just split the Tory party. And, you know, as they move towards reform, there are all these other voters who've moved to Labour who they wouldn't win back. I think the political establishment right now is quite freaked out by Farage and reform. It's all anyone in Westminster talks about every single day.
But
I think that's Oh, Labour people too, behind the scenes.
I think you'll find they are worried in Reform too. But anyway, yes.
Just on that point, like, the reason I call for national inquiry, and I agree with the calls on that, is not any of that, actually. It's because I've got 2 sons. I don't want them growing in a society where the aspersions are cast on them. If I had a daughter, I want her to grow up in a society where if God forbid, something were to happen, she can go to the authorities and she would have the support. That's what this is actually about. And I think that is the right thing to do. I think Keir Starmer made a huge mistake last week. It was bad politics. And because he did make it political, by the way, it has to be about victims.
The Tories made it political too, though, with the Wrecking Amendment. Yep. You know, when the Tories as well didn't enact any of those recommendations, and Kemi Badenoch hadn't actually talked about grooming gangs in the chamber before that point. You know, it's quite grubby politics on all sides, and actually, you know, the fundamentals of the grooming gangs things did not change last week. It's been urgent and important and really, really disgusting and serious and awful for those victims for such a long time, and it was all just spurred by things that Elon Musk said on Twitter. Labour has clearly not been very good at saying there was already a national inquiry. You know, I don't think that people at home watching have got that message. But it's just all really, and I think Labour will be tarred for a really long time by this idea that they voted against an inquiry into grooming gangs. I just think that there's like quite low public literacy on these things. But the Tories, Labour, Reform, it's all been pretty grubby, I think, to be honest.
But what do you think then, Mercy, that Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch are trying to say about the sort of people that they would like to come into the country? Because Kemi Badenoch has also said that not all cultures are equally valid. And she goes on to say in this interview with GB News, it is referring to people who might have been involved in grooming gangs. You know, people who are very, very poor, sort of peasant background, very, very rural, almost cut off from even the home origin countries that they might have been in. What is it that they are advocating then in terms of immigration?
Well, I think there is a problem that they're pointing to. I don't condone that kind of language. I think we need to detoxify. We need to detoxify the debate around immigration. We've seen what can happen when community relations and relations between different ethnic groups are not what they should be in this country. You know, riots literally, quite literally erupt onto the streets. So I think we need to be careful with language. However, what I would say is that we do have a problem with integration in this country, insofar as we really don't have an integration policy at all. And so you do end up with people coming here, who many of whom decades later have not even learnt the language, for example. Many people do come here with views that are not necessarily British values. But I think it's one thing saying we need to integrate communities better, and I think that's a very valid point. But I think you need to be quite careful, because how do you police that? You can't say we're only going to accept people to come to this country if they agree with this, that and the other. Who's going to police those? What are credible beliefs? So I think what the conversation should be about is, if we're saying that we do want to integrate people who come to this country with values that don't align with, from countries whose values don't align with ours, what does that actually look like, and how can we do that humanely?
Right. What is the policy? What's the policy that gets to that end result?
So I actually agree with Mercy there. The debate actually has to be around values. I think it's really a value proposition. So
was Kemi Badenoch wrong to use that sort of language, that not all cultures are valid, she said in one interview when she's talking about people coming from abroad and trying to come into the country? Robert Jenrick's talking about alien cultures. Is this language poisoning the debate, the language of your leader and the Shadow Justice Secretary?
No, I think Kemi was giving an analysis, and a very accurate analysis, because when I agreed with her when she said when she did the Laura Kuenssberg interview, because actually I thought there are cultures who think, for example, FGM's okay, and actually we don't agree with that. She talked about LGBT people being stoned. I don't agree with that. No. It's about values.
Yeah, but what's the policy? What's the policy then that says, well, you're going to have certain countries where you're not going to take people?
Before you even get to the policy, you have to talk about values, and I think that's really important. And I think Kemi will be very, very strong on this. I think Keir Starmer's going to struggle, and I think think we'll see that narrative, we'll see that debate happen over the
But
years.
should culture not be part of the immigration debate, Perrin?
Look, I find it absolutely extraordinary to listen to some of these politicians and read what they have said. This is the party of Churchill, who's the father of the Convention on Human Rights, and we're talking about some language here that is frankly despicable. There's a real challenge for society. And last week, the vote last week was the low point of the 6 months that I've spent in Parliament. What the Conservatives tried to do with that wrecking amendment was wreck a bill that was all about child protection. In my constituency of Camborne, Redruth and Hale, 32% of children are persistently absent from secondary school. Many of those children are vulnerable children. That bill will help protect those children. The Conservatives tried to wreck it with some absolutely appalling piece of politics. It was the lowest point of my 6 months in Westminster. And, you know, Sahib, I really don't think that you know, justifying or trying to justify some of those comments is going to help things. You know, I genuinely don't think that's what you really think.
To be clear, Joe, the legislation last week was very, very bad legislation, and it's going to put our education system on a. It's going to send it back to where we've actually been.
And you did use it. You did attempt to use it as a way of getting a national inquiry.
I think it was very important to have that vote because we want a national inquiry. Labour don't. But actually, let's see how sustainable that position is. By the way, now because apart from the fact that, you know, polling is showing that reform's breathing down their neck, the other bit of this is actually Starmer said anyone who calls for a national inquiry is far right. You know, Sarah Champion's done it, Andy Burnham's done it, Dan Cardin's done it, Paul Ward's done it. How many more MPs are now going to come out and say we want?
All right, I'll come back to Perrin just in a moment. But on the issue of language, do you agree it's despicable, as Perrin thinks that language is despicable?
I would never have used the language that Rob used. I think it's much more nuanced than that, and I've been very clear on that. But I think Kemi made some really important analytical points in that interview and also last night.
Right. In terms, though, of the national inquiry, I mean, as Alva said, do you think that is the wrong decision by Labour not to have a national inquiry when it's been called for locally in Oldham and there are many MPs who want it?
I want this Labour government to focus on protecting vulnerable children. We've had the J report, right? There were 20 recommendations that cost hundreds of millions of pounds, which the Conservatives have done nothing with. I want those recommendations implemented, and I want to work with the Home Office to get those recommendations implemented as quickly as possible, because that's the way that you protect vulnerable children.
Right, and what are you going to do now in terms of pushing for your calls for a national inquiry?
Well, look, we will continue, of course, and, you know, ultimately the call will be from Kemi in terms of deciding what the next bit of this will be. But actually, I think Labour MPs are going to start calling for national inquiries. We're already seeing that. The dam's already broken. They've gone back to their constituencies. Their own constituents want this. And actually, if you want to protect young girls, the best way to do that is to have the data, to have the information, and understand why it is in Rotherham, in Rochdale, in Telford, in Aylesbury, in all the places that Kemi mentioned. Why did this happen, and why was it not dealt with earlier?
Right. To return just briefly, though, to the rhetoric that is being used on the issue of immigration, is this, do you think, purely political in terms of trying to meet the sort of demands, if you like, from reform?
Well, I mean, I feel like we talk about this every single time I'm on because it's such a prevailing issue. Like, immigration, as Mercy said, is filling all of these gaps in the labour market. And Labour has this policy of trying to sort of upskill people and train people here in the UK so that eventually, in the longer term, more British people will be doing those jobs and we won't be so reliant on immigration in the care sector, for example. But that's so long term. You know, the Tories struggled to bring immigration down. Labour's struggling to do it now. And then we have this sort of fictional debate around the edges, as though by just sort of setting a target or sounding tough on it, it will make much of a difference. And I think actually Labour's doing all sorts of things sort of closer to the source point. You know, there was a deal with Iraq yesterday of sort of the beginnings of talks about a direct returns agreement. Like, Iraqis are, you know, one of the most common nationalities coming over in small boats. It's probably a lot of sort of more technical stuff like that that could make the difference on immigration, but the sort of the rhetoric around it is just spiralling off in a completely different direction. And then I think, you know, like, the grooming gang stuff is so serious and it's become a debate about immigration rather than about listening to women and girls, violence against women and girls, which happens in all cultures.
Thank you to all of my guests today. You can see we ran out of time to talk about second homes. It does happen occasionally on the programme, but I'll be back tomorrow at 11:15 with more.
This little game is called Deathmatch. The traitors have been gunning for me since day one.
Time to get out.